as Ron mentioned, I had some extra homework last night, and to begin with, we had a question from Tom yesterday about whether or not the requirements for physical protection of special nuclear material would apply to LSA shipments. And in doing, basically just rereading through the regulations last night in my hotel room, I couldn't find any get-out-of-jail-free card for LSA material. In Part 73, you can see there are some exemptions listed. And those exemptions basically exempt you from the requirements listed for formula quantities of material and for some other reporting requirements. If you have uranium-235 in uranium that's enriched to less than 20%. If you have special nuclear material which is not readily separable from other radioactive material, this B is basically if you have irradiated fuel. So that actually goes to Jay Thomas's question yesterday, where you're exempted from the requirements for formula quantities of special nuclear material if you have irradiated fuel. And there's a separate section in the NRC requirements for physical protection of irradiated fuel. If you have special nuclear material in a quantity not exceeding 350 grams of uranium-235, or what we can't see here is uranium-233 or plutonium or a combination thereof in analytical research or quality control devices or electronic laboratory. So basically this is exempting small sources. In my mind, I know we've done shipments from New Brunswick lab to Japan of small quantities of these materials that are used for calibrating instruments in their fuel production facilities, things like that. Any special nuclear materials being transported by the DOE. There's a whole another regime that Mike Wangler is going to refer to. And special nuclear material at non-power reactors. Even though this material is very dangerous, research reactors aren't subject to a lot of these requirements directly. Then going to the fissile material exemptions in DOT, again, I didn't see anything that said just because the concentration is low enough or the ratio of the fissile material to the other materials, if you've got, if you've got high enriched uranium, even though it's dispersed in, however many thousands of kilograms of waste material that you're talking about, I just don't see anything that tells you you don't have to treat it like special nuclear material. Which, the answer might be divide the load.
That's the same answer I had. I was just hoping you had a different.
I don't. I don't. And I intend to follow up with some of my contacts at the NRC just to try to confirm that. And I'll have your email address. And but I'm just not aware of anything.
Tom, you can't blend it down
No, this is waste from our production facility, so there's no opportunity.
But if you could, it would be an operational cost, obviously, but if you could split the load so that your total masses fall below those thresholds, then you don't have to worry about it. But so that's bad news. Moving on. As Ron said, I'm going to have a few changes to make to these slides. If I'd been prudent, some of this would have been caught before this week, but unfortunately, between having a new baby and the holidays and everything else, I didn't do as good a job as I could have reviewing everything before before this week, so I apologize for that. But these will be basically just editorial changes. But this module will be talking about the specific security requirements imposed by the U.S. NRC on shipments of special nuclear material. And again, the relevant requirements are in 10 CFR 73. We're moving up to the next drawer in our toolbox. And Module 1G showed the U.S. Department of Transportation baseline security requirements. And so, of course, the NRC security requirements are in addition to and above and beyond those required by the DOT. Module 1F established how we categorize the nuclear material, and in the flowcharts that we use to do the categorization, the application boxes identify the requirements that we're going to be discussing today. So again, the green circles highlight the application boxes that we're going to be talking about, and where I'm going to have a little bit of external commentary or new discussion is with the strategic special nuclear material topic, question 5 in application box 4D, which I guess I could do right now. So the first thing to point out is that, again, there's an explicit exemption from the requirements captured in the performance objectives and the requirements captured in 7320, 7325, 7326, which, if you look at those sections of the regulations, which we will in a second ago, they speak to strategic special nuclear material, which was, as we've just seen, has been defined. But there's an exemption for uranium-235 contained in enriched to less than 20%. Right, so a formula quantity means strategic special nuclear material in any combination in a quantity of 5,000 grams or more, computed by the formula of grams of U-235 plus grams of U-233 plus grams of plutonium. This class of material is sometimes referred to as a Category 1 quantity of material. But remember, special nuclear material, or strategic special nuclear material, is defined as uranium-235 contained in uranium enriched to 20% or more in the U-235 isotope, uranium-233, or plutonium. So this is where things get really confusing in the way that the NRC has defined things in their regulations. If you go to the formula quantity definition, it only talks about uranium-235 because it talks about strategic special nuclear material. But then when you go to the definition of strategic special nuclear material, it's only uranium, it only includes uranium that's enriched above 20% uranium-235. So the definitions and the regulations are very confusing. In the regulations, there's no table like we had in the international regulations that split things up for you. It makes it clear. And in going through all this again last night, I had a little bit of an epiphany where I can't go back to, I don't think we have the table in this series of slides, but the term strategic special nuclear material, as far as I can tell, is just a label that the NRC applies to any material that can physically occur in a Category 1 or formula quantity. So it's your plutonium, your uranium-235 enriched above 20%, and your uranium-233. And it's just a label that they apply to those three materials. Because those materials can be, or can occur in a formula quantity, or a Category 1 quantity, they're called strategic special nuclear material. By contrast, uranium enriched to less than 20% can never be a formula quantity. There's no such thing as a Category 1 quantity of uranium-235 enriched to less than 20%. So it's a confusing label, I think, that's just been applied to say that these three materials, plutonium, uranium-235 enriched above 20% or 20% or more, and uranium-233, we'll call them strategic special nuclear material. And so the definition of formula quantity is strategic special nuclear material that in those quantities, 5 kilograms based on that formula. And that's where things get confusing. And so 7320, which we identified here after our question, is the nuclear material strategic special nuclear material? 7320 outlines general performance objectives and requirements. That sounds like it's going to kind of apply to everything if you just read that title. But again, the key thing here is when you read that introductory paragraph, I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but it specifically refers to, in every case, formula quantity, formula quantity, formula quantity, and
The last one's not every case.
right, and says that these material or these requirements, these objectives apply to those quantities. Then at the end, they have this general, this blanket statement that says the physical protection system shall be designed to protect against the design basis threats of theft or diversion of strategic special nuclear material and radiological sabotage as stated in 731A. So despite this sentence here, which seems to be confusing, my premise, my conjecture is that these requirements and then the specific these performance objectives in section 7320 and then the specific requirements that are outlined in 25 and 26 only apply to formula quantities or category 1 quantities of special nuclear material. There's no separate set of rules just for strategic special nuclear material. It's a formula quantity.
And here's what's confusing. The title of 25 doesn't say
Right.
formula quantity.
The title of 25 says performance capabilities for the physical protection of strategic special nuclear material in transit. But the first paragraph, to meet the general performance objectives and requirements of 7320. So you go back to 7320, and 7320 is explicitly referring to formula quantities. This is what happens when regulations are written by lawyers. It's confusing, it's not clear, you get pointed in a bunch of different directions. This is what we tried to simplify with these charts, but even ourselves, we got a little bit wrapped around the axle here. What I'm saying is this decision box and this application box, I think, are redundant because you get there again back here. Once you've determined that you've got a category 1 or formula quantity of special nuclear material, 10 CFR 73 tells you that you're implementing 7320, 7325, and 7326. If you don't have a category 1 quantity, formula quantity, you're down in category 2 or category 3, and there are separate regulations, 7367, I think, for what the NRC calls special nuclear material of moderate strategic significance and special nuclear material of low strategic significance, category 2 and category 3. All of that is a long way of saying that, again, I think this decision, this question box and application box are redundant and probably should just be X'd out of your flow chart. Go ahead, Mike.
Are you sure that strategic nuclear material of moderate strategic significance is not covered by the term strategic special nuclear material?
Yes. Because if you go back to the definitions,
it means uranium-235 enriched 20% or more, uranium-233 or plutonium.
no. Are you looking at special nuclear material of moderate strategic significance?
Special nuclear material.
Right. Okay, so see, now we're bouncing around. So strategic special nuclear material means uranium-235 enriched above 20%, uranium-233, or plutonium. So it's just a label for those materials.
I understand, but whenever you look at the definition of moderate strategic significance, I see uranium-235 greater than 20%, plutonium and U-233.
So, right, less than a formula quantity
Right. Less than-
of strategic special nuclear material, but more than 1,000 grams of uranium-235 contained in uranium enriched to 20% or more in the U-235 isotope, or more than 500 grams of uranium-233 or plutonium, or in combined category of more than 1,000 grams when computed by the equation.
And those terms are contained in the definition of strategic special nuclear material.
Right, but what, see, this is now, this is just, what I'm saying is this is just a label. Strategic special nuclear material. If I have uranium-233 enriched below 20%, by the NRC's definition here, I do not have strategic special nuclear material, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand that, but I thought that you were saying only formula quantities could be strategic special nuclear material.
No, what I'm saying is the requirements of 7320, 7325, and 7326 only apply to formula quantities.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
And that comes
And
about
that's-
by the lead-in paragraph.
Right.
73.
Because, yeah, the introductory paragraph in 7320 says formula quantity of this, formula quantity of this, formula quantity of that. It only talks about formula quantities, and it leaves anything other, category 2 or category 3 quantities, are the requirements are defined in 7367, I think. But this is, I'm trying to cut through the fog of these terms that don't really provide any value. This term provides literally no value, other than highlighting that if it's enriched above 20%, we're a little more concerned about it. Thanks. Any other questions? It's a little bit of a curveball, but again, bottom line is I think you can X out this box and this box on the decision tree and just go from here to there. Similarly, as we talked about, there should be an arrow connecting this application box to that, to chart 2. We've already talked about the DOT's basic requirements. So what we'll be talking about now is the additional NRC requirements. And as with the other modules, there's an appendix that goes into even more detail than I'll be summarizing here for future reference. So the different application boxes that were identified in Chart 4 and Chart 5 are basically capturing the requirements for, with application box 4A for the DOT, all the requirements that apply except for accepted packages. Then irradiated reactor fuel. I'll talk about what we've got outlined as requirements for strategic special nuclear material and category 1 nuclear material. As I just talked about, actually these should all just be the same category 1 requirements. And so I'll ask you to make a note as we go through your slides, just to make that clear. The case in which you want to try to ship multiple shipments that add up to a total that's greater than a formula or exceeds the threshold for formula quantity. Again, the requirements that are applied if you're trying to juke the system, as I mentioned. The category 2 nuclear material, category 3 nuclear material requirements. Then for chart 5, if you get through and you find that you also have source material or byproduct material that qualifies, high-level radioactive waste, irradiated reactor fuel that is less than 100 grams, and special nuclear material, the quantity of concern. Again, the little bit of discrepancy between quantities of concern and Cat 1 and Cat 2 quantities. And of course, requirements are applicable to all modes of transport, and there may be additional specific requirements for the different modes. So starting off again where we've already reviewed a little bit, these are the requirements imposed, the basic requirements imposed by the Department of Transportation and then Homeland Security through the Coast Guard. You have to be aware of the incident reporting requirements. The personnel preparing, executing the shipments have to have proper training, the DOT or the mode codes. Shipping papers have to be prepared in accordance with the regulations and the mode requirements. Personnel need to have the proper identification and credentials to access ports. The masters of the vessels have to have a security plan. Rail cars need to be inspected, and the vessels and ports need to have the proper security procedures in place. For irradiated reactor fuel, the Department of Transportation does have a regulation which, if I remember correctly, it basically just points you to the NRC. Just make sure if you're transporting irradiated fuel, do it the way the NRC tells you to do it. Irradiated reactor fuel, you have to establish an information protection system. Again, information regarding shipments of spent nuclear fuel is considered safeguards information. The requirements for handling and protecting safeguards information are captured in 10 CFR 7322. You have to have a physical protection system implemented to prevent sabotage, to detect, assess, notify, deny, delay. These requirements derive from 10 CFR 7337. 7337 is the particular section of the regulations that outline all the requirements for irradiated fuel. You have to notify authorities prior to each shipment. You have to, similar to the Cat 1 radioactive material shipments, you have to coordinate with the governor's designee of every state you're going to be transiting through. You have to have procedures in place that define how you're going to deal with anticipated safeguards emergencies. You can't be winging it. I mean, you can't anticipate everything, but you have to try to have procedures in place and people trained to know what are we going to do if something happens. You have to have escorts, and those escorts have to have instructions. You don't want to be improvising. You have to have a communication center established, similar to the Movement Control Center. There's lots of ways to skin this cat, but the idea again is that you have a separate, distinct facility that's monitoring the progress of this shipment in real time, communicating with the shipment and its escorts on a regular basis, and prepared to provide support required either by communication or dispatching resources. You're required to maintain a written log as you're tracking the shipment, documenting updates, all clear, no problem, progress, delays, whatever the status of the shipment. So you know, when you're talking about longer shipments, this could be something that you're having to do over a 24-hour period or more. You're going to have shifts of people. Those people all are going to have access to safeguards information and have to go through the basic background checks and trustworthiness and reliability determinations. So it's non-trivial to set all this up and have the people in place. You have to have arrangements with local law enforcement agencies along the route. Not just be aware of who they are or what state patrol office is closest to that node on the highway routing, or you have to have arrangements. You have to coordinate with them all along the route. And believe me, that's a serious undertaking when you're talking about going from South Carolina to Idaho. You've got to identify who you're going to call all along that route. Sometimes it's going to be sheriff, county sheriff. Sometimes it's going to be state patrol because there's no other jurisdiction in the area. but that's got to be determined ahead of time. That's part of the route assessment process. Route and port approval, you have to draft all that, identify all that, capture the route you're going to be shipping, capture who all these local law enforcement agencies are, the governor's designees, who you're going to be coordinating with. So many different stakeholders, which, going back to Dr. Wu's point about, you know, for terrorists, you want to keep the number of people involved low for security reasons, or not for security reasons, but conversely, it becomes a little bit hairy when you start to have a cast of thousands of stakeholders that have to be involved in this shipment. Then you start to worry, well, geez, all these people have the right background checks and have the right qualifications and are trustworthy and reliable. That's sort of difficult to gauge. Of course, going back to the information protection requirements, government officials, local law enforcement agencies, they're all exempted from having to go through any particular safeguards information background check process like I would, or a licensee's agents would. We trust you guys implicitly.
We've been thoroughly checked beforehand.
I'm sure. Scheduled stops. To the extent possible, you want to plan and schedule those stops. Where are you going to stop? Where are you going to refuel? Where are you going to take a break? You're going to have team drivers, like we referred to with the radioactive material Category 1 shipments. So you're not stopping overnight in parking lots and truck stops. This thing keeps moving. But you're going to need to eat meals. You're going to need to have bio breaks. You want to plan those and schedule those. You want to make sure that your escorts are properly trained so that when your conveyance is stopped, at least one of your escorts is monitoring the shipment. Your escorts have to be trained in according to the specific requirements in the appendix of 10 CFR 73. That includes weapons training, lethal force training and expectations. Your escorts have to be communicating on a regular basis with the control center, communication center. You have to provide advance notification to the NRC and, of course, to the governor's designees of any states that you're crossing. Hey, we're doing this shipment. Here's the plan. You have to, the escorts are armed. Again, they're there to interdict and prevent any incursion, any bad actors who might try to approach that shipment. You need to have established how your escorts are going to communicate with the communication center, with local law enforcement agents along the entire route. You have to have that figured out. The vehicle has to be equipped with immobilization equipment. So if our escorts are defeated, if the vehicle is commandeered, taken over by bad actors, we can remotely disable the vehicle so that they can't take it anywhere. Your vehicle driver, and I mean really more than just the driver, both drivers and probably your escort personnel, you want to make sure they know how to do that, how to implement the vehicle immobilization and other security procedures. We're expected to provide escorts when we're doing maritime shipments. If the shipment vessel is docked in a heavily populated area, provide accompanying escort shipment vessels in the U.S. territorial waters. So when we have those Foreign Research Reactor Return Program shipments coming into the Port of Charleston, one of the nice things is that it's what's the base? It's Joint Base now. It's not Naval Weapons Station anymore. It's Joint Base Charleston now. Apparently, it's an Air Force port now too, or something. But anyway, it's not just Navy anymore. But the nice thing is that obviously has a high elevated element of security personnel there present full time already. They're very helpful. Here's the chart I was talking about. So when we again, to beat this dead horse, when we're talking about strategic special nuclear material in the NRC's definitions, what we're talking about is plutonium, uranium-235 enriched 20% or more, or uranium-233. There's no discussion of quantities in this definition. So again, I think this is just a label to say that these are the only quantities and types of material that could end up being a Category 1 quantity or formula quantity. So they call them strategic.
Excuse me.
Yep.
So if you have just 1 microgram of plutonium, it's called strategic special nuclear material.
Right. But my point is that term strategic special nuclear material doesn't imply anything about what kind of requirements have to be applied to it.
So why is irradiated fuel not strategic special nuclear material? It might have some plutonium in there.
That's right. That's right.
It's highly diluted.
I can't tell you why it's not called strategic special nuclear material except to say that it's exempted from the requirements by the 73.6 in the U.S. Absolutely. Inside that irradiated fuel is going to be some of this, some of that, no doubt. But what 10 CFR 73.6 says, if that, and I don't know if you can bounce to it or not, the exemptions, because I can't remember if it says strategic special nuclear material or special nuclear material. But if that material is not separable from the other radionuclides, right? So it just says special nuclear material, which is not readily separable from other radioactive material, which has a total external radiation dose of 100 rem per hour at a distance of 3 feet. I.e., if it's in irradiated fuel, you're exempt from all these requirements. Instead, you have to meet the other requirements that are specified for irradiated fuel.
Basically, what Mike has discovered, looking at this whole slide should be just Xed, in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's literally just a label that they painted on plutonium, U-235 enriched to 20% or more, and U-233.
I was only going to mention that in the case of irradiated fuel, it's not covered under strategic nuclear material because they have specific requirements already built into the regulations for irradiated fuel.
Yeah. You could have, again, in your irradiated fuel, this is kind of the question Jay Thomas was asking yesterday. In your irradiated fuel, you could have 2 kgs of plutonium. But if you meet these requirements, you can say, hey, it's not readily separable unless somebody takes this stuff through, a very complicated and cost-intensive and resource-intensive reprocessing facility. And your dose rate's in excess of 100 rem at 3 feet without intervening shielding. You don't have to treat it like a formula quantity or Category 1 quantity of plutonium. You treat it like irradiated fuel. And there's a whole other suite that I'm going through right now. And what you can see is these requirements for irradiated fuel are fairly substantial. You're butting up pretty close against the requirements for formula quantities, but not quite. And again, conversely, they don't apply these kinds of requirements in France.
That's the point that I've seen, and I still have a question about the international. We can talk about that offline, because I don't want to destroy this. But now I understand better that the U.S. has basically separated the radiated fuel out and has its own, and yeah, the requirements are pretty much almost close to like the Cat 1 or
Right.
2 shipment. Unfortunately, international, they haven't done that. They haven't separated it out with the radiated. So I still don't have a clear interpretation of the table. And like I said, I can talk about that offline.
Right.
But I do understand better now of how we handle it domestically.
Right. And, once upon a time when I was first stumbling through all this years ago, I asked a contact in the security group at NRC, why are our regulations set up this way? Because I was learning more about how they do things in France and with my comrades at French Arriva TN, and how they, what physical protection requirements they have for irradiated fuel. And what was explained to me, and take it with a grain of salt, this was just conversation between two people, it's not dogma, but the US NRC's requirements for physical protection of irradiated fuel are intended to prevent sabotage, not theft. Whereas for the Category 2 and Category 3 requirements, they're more about preventing theft and enabling recovery of material that's diverted quickly. These requirements, which seem so much more robust, whereas other countries are relying on the self-protection of the material and allow themselves less stringent requirements, are intended to prevent sabotage that would create potentially could create a radiological incident. That's what was explained to me in terms of the philosophy, why we have so much more stringent requirements for irradiated fuel in the U.S.
And I think you're exactly right on that. The chart that you have there is very similar to the chart that's in the convention.
Right.
On nuclear
Right.
materials, except that irradiated fuel is treated differently in the U.S. than it is in the convention.
Right.
And that's where you can get into problems for international shipments.
Right.
But in theory, if you meet the NRC requirements for physical protection for irradiated fuel, you should meet anybody else's.
Right. And that's, and that's the sort of stakeholder interaction that has to happen. Like I said, especially with these foreign research reactor return programs, you could be operating in a country that barely has any security infrastructure whatsoever. Well, what are you going to do? If you're the DOE and you want to make sure this is done right and done with some assurance of physical protection, you impose the regulations, and you pay for that. But, if you're shipping through France, you leave it up to them maybe, and everyone understands.
As Mike points out, the chart itself is what's in the CPPNF.
Yeah.
But there is a footnote attached to ready to fuel that says it's up to the state to designate.
That's right. Okay, so here's where I want to suggest everyone in your books make a little note. What this should say is formula quantity or Category 1 quantity of, you can say strategic special nuclear material, but I would even go so far as to say just delete that because it's not a useful term. But so these next 6 slides, these requirements all apply to Category 1 quantities or formula quantities of special nuclear material.
And to a great extent, they're duplicated by charts later for Cat 1.
Right. There'll be some overlap. The way we set this up. But so again, 10 CFR 7320 establishes the general performance requirements and objectives. Basically, ensure that you have a physical protection system in place to maintain the security. And when you get into 7325, you start to get the specific requirements, and 7326 gets even more detailed about what particular things need to happen. And of course, I'm forgetting now, but I believe there's also a reg guide or new reg implementation guidance for the revised 10 CFR 73, and I'll have to double check that. But you have to restrict the access to an activity in the vicinity of the transports and the material. Nobody should be coming near that shipment. That's not authorized.
561.
There you go. That's for irradiated reactor fuel, right? That's for the new 10 CFR 73.37 that just came out. Thanks. Yeah, and that's the new reg for the radioactive material quantities of concern. Right. You need to have capabilities established to prevent delay and respond to any unauthorized entry or introduction of unauthorized material or unauthorized removal of the material from the transport. You need to have schedule. You need to have a strategy around your scheduling, avoiding irregular patterns, avoiding areas of suspect infrastructure, and limiting the amount of storage time for the shipments, and limiting the amount of time that could be subject or exposed. Obviously, deliver the material at a time when the consignee is present. If you're delivering it to some place that doesn't open until 9, make sure the truck doesn't show up at 7. And you know, that kind of goes along with everything that we do with other categories of material. Similarly, make arrangements with the LLEA, the local law enforcement agencies. Again, make arrangements means engage them, coordinate them, plan with them, what might happen, what they might need to do, how you'll communicate with them, how you would engage their resources. It's not just be aware that they're there. You're not just hoping that they'll answer 911 and know what to do. And that becomes especially important in more remote areas that don't have a lot of experience with nuclear material. As I think it was Ron mentioned the other day, you'll find local law enforcement agents around nuclear power plants, very comfortable with this stuff, very comfortable with these requirements, very knowledgeable, understand, and very ready and willing to support any need. But if you get out to locations further remote from nuclear power plants, I've engaged agents in Washington when I was once upon a time working on a project with Department of Homeland Security, basically an outreach project to try to establish means and methods for detecting and interdicting nuclear materials brought into ports. And there was I think he was a sheriff's deputy. He didn't want to hold a detector because the detector had a check source on it. You know, I tried to explain it's not, look, you know, it's not dangerous. It's a very small source, but you know, you're going to find varying levels of knowledge and experience and expertise, you know, across the country in terms and in people that you may need to rely on for support in case of an event. That's why a big part of the funding for the old Yucca Mountain effort was outreach, training for any first responders and local law enforcement agents who might be along the routes. Obviously, you're going to generate a security plan. It's important to note that that security plan, like with irradiated fuel, that there's going to be a lot of information in there. It's probably safeguards information. You need to make sure that it's marked correctly, it's protected correctly, it's secured correctly. You're not going to just leave your security plan for your Category 1 shipment on your desk and go get lunch. Documentation of custody transfer. This is simply a process of identifying, especially when there's multimodal transport, when there's handoffs. You want to document, pre-plan. Mike Valenzano is going to be escorting this truck from point A to point B. Tom Holly is going to be escorting the rail from point B to point C. You want to plan all that ahead of time. You want to document that Mike Valenzano is going to hand it off to Tom Holly, because Tom and I may never have even met before. How do I know that I'm giving it to the right guy? You want to plan that. You want to document it on a chain of custody document, a hand-to-hand receipt, we call it, that's going to have the name and information about each individual who's going to be taking custody, taking responsibility of the shipment through however many nodes there are going to be, so that when that handoff happens, I look at my paper, I see Thomas Holly, his information, we can check each other's IDs. Yep, I'm getting it from Mike Valenzano, I'm giving it to Tom Holly. We both sign. He gets a copy to keep taking with him. I keep a copy to say, yeah, I gave it to Thomas Holly. Your security organization, basically this is telling you, if you're transporting this kind of material, make sure you have an actual professional organization responsible for this. Again, you're not improvising, you're not winging it. You need to have plans and procedures in place. What are you going to do? What kind of threats, thefts, sabotage can you anticipate? And what are you going to do about it? Now, obviously, you're not going to say, well, specifically if we're at this bridge over, the Mississippi River, this is what we're going to do. And if we're at this railroad crossing in the middle of Montana, that's what we're going to do. It's not necessarily going to be that detailed, but you're going to want to talk about what is our general response going to be, posture. What are we going to do if we have a breakdown, if we have some sort of roadblock that we encounter, if we have somebody who tries to take over the truck, if you have to think about what are the different contingencies that might happen, how are we going to deal with it? You could have the same response for every contingency. Here's what we're going to do. These people are going to call those people are going to be dispatched here, and end of story. And it's just, it could be very rote, but maybe not. Transfer and storage during the shipment. You need to make sure that if you have planned stops, if you have planned transfers where there's going to have to be a amount of time, you've got intermodal transfer, you got to move it from a railroad to a tractor trailer or something. You got to make sure that you know where that's going to happen, and there's proper security in place and arrangements in place where that's going to happen. Again, access control. Nobody should be getting near that stuff who's not already authorized and approved. Testing and maintenance. Specific equipment, tools, communications equipment, security equipment, locks. You want to make sure that they've been tested. You want to make sure that they work. You want to make sure that your batteries aren't dead, so on and so forth. You need to have a detailed route plan. You need to have your cargo compartment securely locked. You need to have, and again, there's more details to this than just what's in this paragraph, but you need to have basically you want to have hardened vehicles. You don't want to just put this in the back of a U-Haul and hope somebody can't take a metal cutter to it and just climb in through the side of your truck. Your escort vehicles have to be hardened as well. You want to make sure that they're not exposed, because obviously a strategy could be to take out all the escorts first. You want to make sure that there's nothing and nobody on this vehicle or around this vehicle that's not supposed to be there. You want to make sure that you have good communications between all your stakeholders, between your vehicle and your escorts, between your vehicle and the communication center, between the escorts and the communication center, so on and so forth. Redundant communication systems as well. That doesn't mean you have two cell phones. It means you have systems that can work if another one fails. And the most typical is your cell phone communications and then your satellite communications. Almost all vehicles, all the commercial vehicles in the U.S. now have a satellite tracking system that also comes with a satellite communications capability. Again, protections at stops. The regulations actually get fairly specific about what you need to have deployed. 7 armed escorts, at least 3 maintaining continuous visual surveillance. Transfers between the modes, ensure the transfers are minimized to the extent possible. If you don't have to keep shifting from sea to road to rail to road to sea, don't do it. Obviously that becomes harder to achieve with international transports. Accompany air shipments with 2 armed escorts. That's why you're usually chartering a cargo aircraft for these kinds of shipments. You're not necessarily just putting this on the next Delta freighter. Again, escort vehicles, conveyance, clear. Rail shipments, same thing. You want to have escorts on your rail shipments. In my experience, we don't use rail very often. The reason being, the railroads don't really want to move this stuff. They don't want to deal with us. They don't want to deal with the perceived risk of, look at that, the unfortunate commuter rail accident that just happened in New York. It's going to take them quite a while to figure out what happened, clear that railroad, get it running again.
It's running to death.
Right. Now imagine, though, if there was a radioactive material package. Right. And the railroads perceive a whole lot of costs associated with that, a whole lot of loss. They don't want to take the risk. So we're not, in my experience, we don't move much material by rail very often. The exception for me would be when we have 4 or more casks, I think, of spent fuel coming in through Charleston. They'll use a rail line, Charleston to Savannah River. That, again, part of it is there's a good relationship in South Carolina. Everything's contained in South Carolina. All the stakeholders are now very familiar with the operations. So there's less of an issue. But again, same basic philosophy. Make sure there's nothing or no one unauthorized on board. Only containers weighing 5,000 pounds or more to be shipped on open rail cars. So if you have a smaller package, make sure it's in a closed conveyance. And again, maintain communications with the Movement Control Center. For sea, transport only on container ships. Accompany shipments with 2 armed escorts. Ports of call, minimize the domestic ports of call. If you've got a ship with this material on it, probably you're not going to have more than 1 port of call. You're not going to be stopping to drop other things off or pick other things up, but you could if you wanted to combine shipments. Again, make sure that there's communication, ship-to-shore communications. And continuing on, so again, with the Category 1 material, you're going to have safeguards information. You're going to want to protect that information. You're going to want to make sure that the people who have that information have been cleared for access, gone through background checks. You want to make sure that you're notifying the various stakeholders and parties of the shipment. You want to make sure that all the parties have the proper precautions and security measures and procedures in place. You're going to notify the NRC, their operations center. You're going to keep them appraised. You're going to let them know when the shipment's completed, and you're going to be notifying them basically anytime there's a problem. Just as an aside, I mentioned yesterday that, to my knowledge, the only people who are moving Category 1 quantities or formula quantities of special nuclear material are OST, NNSA's Office of, is it Secured Transportation? I think Office of Secured Transportation. There's no regulation that says OST is the only entity who is allowed to do this or who can do this. It's simply they, as an organization, have been created and equipped with the resources to do this because there's a demand, there's a need to move formula quantities, category 1 quantities of material for the weapons, to support the weapons complex. None of these requirements are impossible to meet for a commercial provider. It's just there's no incentive for us. There's a lot of work there. There's a lot of effort there. There's a lot of manpower, resources that need to be required. And there's not a demand for a company like mine, or a company like NAC, or a company like Visionary Solutions, or a company like Hitman, what have you, to move category 1 quantities of nuclear material. So we don't have the procedures in place. We don't have the resources in place. We don't have the hardened vehicles available. It's just a supply and demand issue. All that might change when and if we start delivering MOX fuel in this country. There's some other opportunities like that if any sort of reprocessing ever came to fruition. MFFF, DOE's grappling with this with the MFFF. How are they going to move MOX fuel, which will include category 1 quantities of plutonium, to commercial power plants? One of the issues they're having is they're developing fuel packages that look just like all the other fuel packages. They're 12, 13, 14 feet long, weigh a few thousand pounds. And in the commercial power plant business, we put 6 of them on a tractor trailer, and we treat them like category 3 shipments, and we deliver them to power plants, no problem. Well, OST has these really fancy, really neat, hardened tractor trailers, or actually they're straight trucks, I think. Regardless, the way they're designed and the way they're built up, they can only take 1 package. So they meet all the security requirements, but now there's a big question about operations. How many deliveries does a power plant want to have? This truck coming in, 2 fuel assemblies at a time, 1 package at a time, to try to build up the inventory to reload their fuel, the reactor. So